Ni hao. Yeah. That's about the extent of my Mandarin and Taiwanese. So thanks for putting up with my English today. And so as Lei said, I've been a medical writer for over 20 years, 25 years probably, in the pharmaceutical industry. Mainly in regulatory writing, but I've done publications and medical education and the whole deal. So medical writing's a profession where we're mainly scientists, have scientific backgrounds, but we also like writing and presenting data. And so we have to understand the data in order to present it well. So we tend to have a diverse background. Some medical writers are nurses, some are PhD researchers, some have an undergraduate degree in science and a graduate degree in another discipline. So medical writing uses a diverse skill set of analyzing data and coming up with the words to present it right, and also understanding the regulations and the requirements for the documents as well. So that's a little overview of medical writing. But today I'm talking about the IB and how to prepare an investigator's brochure for a submission, mainly an initial first-in-human investigator's brochure for an NDA or CTA, but the IB is a global drug document, so it can be used for any submission for an initial clinical trial. So how many people have heard of the investigator's brochure before, or raise your hands? Yeah. Okay, fair number. Okay. You don't count. But all right, so just a little disclaimer here. And so the learning objectives today are to understand the process for preparing the IB and for an initial application, first-in-human type of IB, and then we'll focus on how to develop the IB as well. So planning for the IB takes a lot of project management skills, actually. So a medical writer tends to have a lot of project management skills as well. The main focus is to think about the timeline of when you're targeting the document to be done. A key milestone is actually to start the IB is the availability of the key toxicology data, which is the key safety data for the non-clinical research of the drug. So we're targeting for the IND and CTA submission date, which tends to be maybe a little fluid at the initial planning stage, depending on the availability of all the preclinical work that goes into the submission, the initial INDs or CTA submission. So just in general, it's also advisable to have one IB per drug globally. And it's just easier from a management point of view, and for presenting safety on the drug, you want to encompass all the indications that the drug is being studied for in the one global IB. Sometimes there are more than one IBs for different formulation types, but I would highly recommend, if possible, to have one global IB. And we've been successful at doing that at J&J. Even with our Japan colleagues, they have additional requirements, but they'll translate that and they'll add in a few things to their translated version, but basically they use our global IB. So the the IB writing team is a sub-team of the IND and CTA submission team. It's a cross-functional team. The IB, takes a village of people, non-clinical scientists from the pharmacology discovery background, the pharmacodynamics, biomarkers, translational medicine, PK, tox, chemistry, manufacturing controls. The clinical leader is involved early on to a clinical scientist often, and a medical writer like me. We tend to glue all the people together. And others who are involved or may review the IB are the compound development leader, regulatory, QC is very important, and other management within the various departments listed there as well. And also project management is a key function to provide support as well to the medical writer. So again, I can't emphasize enough to start early with preparing and planning for the IB. I've even started them, a year in advance if you know that a team is truly moving forward with a new drug. So we have what's called an NME declaration, a new molecular entity declaration. And so at that point, you can start talking about the IND documents, including the IB. But typically it's 3 to 9 months before the submission date. And in the initial discussions, you want to focus on what studies do you really need to present in the IB? What are the key studies with noteworthy findings that the investigators will find important as far as scientific background and safety background, and also that the health authorities are expecting. The FDA has, certain requirements for the key tox study, for instance, but you don't have to include every non-clinical study that you've done with the drug in development. For instance, a lot of background methodology on how you are doing your animal models may not be required. And you want to be careful as well because the IB is a very confidential document. You're presenting a lot of confidential information, especially in the early IB. There's a lot of background pharmacology discovery information. And so you want to kind of maybe limit some of the methodology that could reveal some internal, secrets or company-specific methods for doing things. But you also want to, be open about, full disclosure about information that is important for safety and for understanding the drug. So there's a balance there. Sometimes we've had legal review our initial IBs because there are some concerns over revealing patent information, for instance. And also for an initial IND, in addition to all the non-clinical studies, there may actually be some clinical studies to summarize because if you're doing an initial IND for the US, you may have already done phase 1 studies outside of the US to summarize in the IB. So, part of the initial process is gathering all the materials and background information that are available on the drug. So there may be a monograph about the drug that was used for management review of the drug for this NME declaration, a clinical development plan, any non-clinical reports, studies, summary documents, tables. The IND requires certain summary documents also for non-clinical to be submitted. any literature references, background on the disease. Actually, similar drugs may provide some information that's useful for writing the initial IB. And there may be an internal document called the target product profile on the drug that companies often develop. So the ICH E6 guideline, ICH is the International Council on Harmonization. It's a sort of a global organization that's back in the 90s put out guidances on the content and somewhat of the format of key essential documents for clinical research. So the IB is considered one of the essential documents for clinical research that's described in this GCP guidance. Actually, this guidance is actually one of the better of the ICH guidances. Some of the ICH guidances are less specific, but this one is actually pretty good, pretty specific, and provides a balance of the content that you need to include in the IB and a pretty good outline of the exact order of the material you need to include. So the ICH guidance actually, talks about the audience. So it's always, when you're writing, it's always good to keep the audience in mind of whom you're writing for. So the investigators, of course, it's called the Investigator's Brochure, the investigators in your clinical studies. Study site research coordinators at the sites. The IRBs, review boards, ethics committees, site-specific or regional or other special review committees, regulatory and health authorities, of course, who will review the initial application to approve that the initial first-in-human clinical study can proceed. Any auditors, regulatory auditors, internal to the company auditors, quality assurance people, and other, various personnel and within your companies will use the IB as a source document as well. So it's good to keep that in mind. So the requirements are that the sponsor provides an up-to-date IB to the investigators, and the investigators are actually responsible for providing that to the ethics committees or IRBs, their research committees that will approve the study to move forward. And then if there's an investigator-sponsored study, the sponsor investigator should determine whether the IB is available from the manufacturer. So the content provides background information on the drug, non-clinical summaries, any clinical studies, and last but not least, the guidance to the investigator on the drug. And the information should be presented in a concise, simple, objective, balanced, and non-promotional form. So the IB is a very scientific document. It's, a summary, but it's non-promotional, non-commercial. So at my own company, we don't have marketing or anyone like that, review the IB. But it enables the clinicians or potential investigators to understand the drug and the study to make their own risk assessment of the study and the appropriateness of the proposed trial, i.e. the benefit-risk balance based on non-clinical information. So the ICH guidelines kind of go through each section and what the requirements are. And we've, adapted this, and I know many companies have, into a template, a Word template that provides, the basic outline that aligns with the ICH guidance. So the title page has certain requirements: the sponsor name, the identity of the product. It can be just a drug code name early on, the edition number, and a confidentiality statement, table of contents. So the initial section of the IB is actually a high-level summary, sort of an executive summary, in other words. Usually it's around 2 to 5 pages. Hopefully for an initial IB, it's more like 2 pages versus 5. You want to highlight the significant chemical characteristics of the drug, the pharmacology of the drug, toxicology, PK, any metabolic information, and any clinical information available. So it's supposed to be relevant to the stage of the clinical development of the product. So actually, as the IB gets updated, you can add more non-clinical information, add more clinical information. Then as the IB moves along into phase 1-2 studies, you tend to reduce the amount of non-clinical information that's in the IB and maybe make it even more of a high-level summary than what's in the initial IB. So the introduction then is in the next section. It talks about the background and the rationale for performing research with this drug. What's the target of the drug? Is it first in class? Why is this drug an advantage to study versus others for that particular disease? So you go over the mechanism of action as well in the introduction, and you go over the kind of the general development plan of the drug as well. The next section is the what we call the CMC section. It provides a summary of the product substance, including the chemical or structural formula, a brief summary of those relevant properties, the pH of the drug, for instance, and a description of the formulations, including excipients, should be provided. We generally don't put a lot of quantitative detail on the excipients in our initial IBs. We usually provide instructions separately with the drug that's provided to the clinical study sites. So we keep the quantitative information on the excipients at a higher level or really not at all. But we do list all the excipients that are included. Instructions for storage and handling should also be given. Again, we don't go into tremendous detail. We say whether it should be frozen or not, et cetera. But we provide those details in a separate packet of information that's provided with the drug to the sites. Again, some of this is around confidentiality as well, being a little cautious about what you put in the IB. So the bulk of an initial IB is the non-clinical study summaries, and these are summaries of the key studies that have been conducted, relevant pharmacology, tox, PK, and any metabolism studies, any other special toxicity studies that have been done as well. We use a balance of summary text and tables to provide detail. Actually, the ICH guidelines lists very specific information you should include in the non-clinical studies, the number of sex of animals, all that information there. We usually tabulate that information, and sometimes we put it in the attachments in the back of the IB, and then save the text of the IB for more higher level description of what was studied and the results, any important tox findings, for instance. Another very important piece of information for the initial IB is the dose justification. So the dose justification is often mainly written by the PK biologist representative on the team. It's usually evaluated by a biologics review committee. I work mainly with biologics drugs, so that's why I'm saying biologics, but a review committee that reviews the potential safety issues with the dose being proposed for the initial clinical study. And it involves some safety factors as well. A factor of, tenfold or whatever is sometimes thrown in based on the being conservative for that first-in-human clinical study. So that tends to be the last piece coming in for the IB because it's synthesizing a lot of the information that is coming in through the non-clinical research. But it's probably one of the most important sections of the IB. So the effects in humans, for an initial IB, you really just provide a brief overview of the planned study. The investigators will get the full clinical protocol for the study, so you just want to be given an abbreviated overview of that first-in-human study. So you may not have any clinical experience, so that section may be very small in the initial IB. Or if you do have clinical study experience, you'll need to summarize the studies or study that have been conducted to date, emphasizing usually PK and safety, or usually, if you're summarizing a phase 1 study, some preliminary efficacy, but you don't want to overemphasize efficacy in an initial IB. Again, you want to be non-promotional, and so be conservative about what you write about efficacy. And then again, any information you have about pharmacology, you may even have biomarker information as well. So that effects in humans section will emphasize, as the IB moves along in development, more safety and efficacy information and any dose response information you have. And as you expand across multiple trials for an indication, you may provide data in more of an integrated form in the IB, including tabular summaries of adverse events and so forth. And then as the IB, as the drug gets marketed, you'll have a section called marketing experience. Initially, you'll just say there's no marketing experience for a drug in development. But then as the drug gets marketed, you'll list the countries where it's approved and where marketing was withdrawn actually as well, if there was any of that. It's probably good to list the specific indications in each country as well, because there can be subtle differences as well. And one of the most important sections is at the end of the IB, the summary of data and guidance for the investigator. This section summarizes all the sections that come before it. And it also provides interpretation and the implications of the non-clinical data for clinical use. So that's the guidance for the investigator piece for the investigator performing the clinical study. And it's also important because it may be the only section that gets read by the investigator. They may just flip back to that section as well. So for an initial IB, this section is based on the non-clinical data. So you'll emphasize any toxicity findings and then any relevant precautions that you've included in the protocols, for instance, to manage anything like that. And then any drug administration issues or specifics based on prior experience, if you have any with the drug or any anticipated experience with drug administration. Also, as the IB moves along in development, there's this section called the reference safety information that actually the EU requires to have now listed as that specifically. And it's supposed to be in a designated section in the IB. We put it in this back section because it seems to fit best there. So the reference safety information, the IB per safety reporting requirements becomes the place where the expectedness of an adverse reaction is determined by the sponsor, and that has implications for expedited safety reporting of the drug. So if an event is listed in the IB, then it's generally considered expected under safety reporting requirements. So it may not then have to be reported in as expedited a fashion as if it wasn't listed in the IB, i.e. it's unexpected. So we and I think a number of companies now produce the summary of table of adverse drug reactions that we place in that reference safety information section. And adverse drug reactions are not just adverse events. It's not just a data dump of adverse events. It's a table that's created based on a careful safety review of the drug, of the clinical trial experience with the drug, and later on even based on the marketing experience. So an adverse drug reaction is one that's an adverse event that's at least has a reasonable possibility that it has a relationship with the drug. So again, this is based on a careful evaluation with a cross-functional team, usually including a safety physician, clinicians, maybe even non-clinical people. There may be some non-clinical related ADRs or laboratory events that are considered ADRs. So in our company, we have a quarterly review of drug safety, and that includes evaluation of ADRs. So then we may need to update the IB through an IB addendum. We usually update this table periodically during the development of the drug. So that's just a little bit about the safety reporting implications of this section of the IB. So this is a graphic on the initial IB process. The IB, again, there's quite a process involved in preparing an IB. It's quite a cross-functional document. I always found it one of the more fun documents for me to write as a medical writer because it involves almost every aspect of the drug, of the research and development of the drug at least. And but to get an IB of good quality, it needs to go through a lot of different reviews and steps along the way. So there's an initial decision to initiate the IB. We'll have that planning meeting again. And then what we call functional area authors provide some of the key non-clinical sections for the IB. So those are the non-clinical scientists, the toxicology lead, the PK lead, the pharmacology discovery lead, translational medicine lead. There's more and more diverse types of non-clinical studies being done, so there's more people involved now in preparing an IB. So we emphasize that the functions provide QC'd sections to the medical writer because we want to produce a quality document in the end, so we want to make sure QC is built in from the beginning. So the medical writer takes the input on the non-clinical sections. Usually the writer will write up the clinical sections, and that summary of data may not be well drafted initially, but the writer will work with the clinicians and non-clinical to summarize that section. And then that initial summary section we'll prepare. And then we distribute the first draft of the IB. We'll give the team a certain amount of time to review. And then usually for the first draft, we'll actually give the team a longer amount of time, maybe even 10 days to review. Some of the non-clinical functions may still be preparing their sections, so we'll give them that initial time before the first draft review meeting, so that by the time we have that first draft review meeting, hopefully you have all the key core input on the non-clinical studies. Then we'll have that first draft review meeting. There may be some holes in the data. You may not quite have that final tox data. That's usually the study that takes the longest to do and report out. And it's also one of the key studies. So then you'll identify the actions for the team to work on to get to that second draft. So and you may need to revise the timeline along the way, and also make sure that the team knows what they need to do. You may have some non-clinical scientists who haven't worked on an IB before, and so you may need to do some education of what the requirements are for an IB and show them some examples and so forth. I've actually sat down with my non-clinical scientists and carefully explained our template and the ICH guidelines and what's required, and showed them examples to try to keep things moving along. So then we get to the second draft review stage, and hopefully by that point there aren't any holes in the data. You have everything you need. Basically, sometimes that doesn't really happen, but that way. But hopefully, the team will, as a team, I believe, everyone can comment on each other's sections. We all have the same goal to provide a high-quality document. So clinical may have a lot of good input on the non-clinical sections to make sure that the data is summarized and presented in a way that the potential investigators will find useful and complete. So then we'll have that second draft review meeting. Again, the goal is that second draft is as complete as possible. So then, hopefully the toxicology section is pretty well done. And before we send out a third draft that we call the approval draft, we want to make sure the IB is extremely complete. All the summary sections are well drafted, and all the key messages are in the document. So the IB provides sort of initial opportunity to also create some key messages for the drug regarding safety. So you want to get those key messages right by working with your clinician, maybe your regulatory people as well. So then the first in-human IB will go to the team will, approve that it's ready to be sent to this first-in-human committee, we call it at J&J. They review all first-in-human IBs and protocols and the key non-clinical toxicology report to ensure that this drug is truly ready to be administered in a clinical study, in a first-in-human phase 1 study. So they'll review all this data that they get via the IB and the protocol and other supportive documents. They'll decide if it's ready, if the drug is ready to be administered to humans. And then if we do get any comments on the IB from first-in-human committee, we'll incorporate them. Usually they'll have more comments on the clinical protocol, actually, than the actual IB. Then we'll send it for a final approval review. Meetings are optional, but I usually like to have a meeting to make sure you lock down the document and there's no straggling, email exchanges. Then you have that meeting and that's it. No more comments. Pencils down. And then a very important step is QC. We fortunately have a QC department that will review the IB, make sure it's internally consistent, and that the functions have aligned their data with the source non-clinical reports as well. If you don't have a QC department, you may want to ask the non-clinical scientists to have a third party, maybe someone in their department, to review all the data that's presented in the IB versus the actual non-clinical summaries and reports. And then also the medical writer should have someone else then review the IB, not the actual writer who wrote the IB, because by that point, they don't have quite the unbiased view of the document as a whole. But fortunately, we have a QC department that does that. And then we prepare the IB for electronic approval. We have what we call document specialists, make sure it's technically sound. And by that, I mean the document is technically sound. Any links to tables, the word cross-references feature we use, we make sure they all work, that the PDF of the document is what's actually submitted, meets the submission requirements of the health authorities. So there's a whole list of things that the document needs to meet to be submission ready. Like the FDA prefers 12-point Times New Roman font and so forth. Then the IB is ready to approve. We tend to do electronic approval at J&J. It tends to be quicker, but they can, the lead clinician, we call the molecule responsible physician, actually can, sign a wet signature page, but make sure that's archived in a retrievable system. We use an electronic document management system, which is especially important for the IB because it gets updated. And then we send out a notification to the team and other key people, partners. We may have a partner company involved. So we may need to review the IB with the partner company as well. Different partners have different ways of working, so we establish that at the onset as well in the planning. Some partners like to be very hands-on in the review. Some are actually providing data for the IB. Some partners are okay and just letting us kind of run with it, and they'll review it, but they're not, very involved. So we got the IB done, and we send out a notification. And the notification includes not just the team, but our safety department to make sure that our safety people are aware that this IB is done and that the clinical study may be starting up soon. So the safety group would use the IB as a reference document, as I said earlier, for safety reporting and regulatory as well. So the IB needs to be evaluated at least annually for an update. So about 3 months before the 1-year anniversary of the IB, and every year thereafter, you should have a review meeting to decide if the IB needs to be updated or not. And you should document that decision as well. It doesn't have to be updated every year, but the ICH guideline says to have that annual review to see if the IB needs to be updated every year. And there's alternative ways of updating. You can do an IB addendum to update certain key information without having to update the whole IB. Or you can do an amendment, I suppose. I think some companies do that. So anyway, so that's sort of the end of my talk session. Then we're going to have a workshop now. But before the workshop, does anyone have any questions about the IB process or content of the IB? Okay. Yeah, so she's asking under what circumstances is the IB updated? What kind of information would trigger that process? So for an earlier IB, you would, the first update would tend to be a year after you did the last one, because there tends to not be a lot of new information before that time. So you would report on any safety data you would have in the ongoing first-in-human clinical study. The study likely wouldn't be done at that point, but you would need to typically want to report on data from the first-in-human clinical study that you would have. Again, you would have that planning meeting and decide with clinical, is there a certain cut point coming up, a certain milestone? Is the study, has the study completed certain cohorts? And do you have relevant data to report? Or, was there an important safety finding in a study? And that may occur, early on. It could include, just the first couple patients dosed in the study. There could be a safety issue, and you may want to get that out to the investigators right away. So then you might do an IB addendum right away with important clinical study safety information. And again, if you have any additional non-clinical studies that are ongoing, non-clinical studies continue for, they can continue for a number of years. Sometimes you do reproduction, fertility studies later on in development. So, and you may do some additional non-clinical information on or models of related to different indications than your initial indication. So yeah, there could be a number of triggers, both non-clinical studies and important clinical study information. And later on in development, you tend to wait till a phase 2 or 3 study is complete and you've analyzed that data and have done a clinical study report before you include that analyzed information in the IB, so that that data is, is consistent and valid and has been thoroughly reviewed and reported on. Okay. Yeah.
For a small company without a regular team as big as Janssen, we probably need to collaborate with some consulting firm or some like a professional medical writer. So what would you suggest how the small company like us to select what kind of the partner we cooperate with?
Okay. Yeah, a lot of if you're also using CROs to help conduct the operational aspects of the study, sometimes those CROs will have a medical writing division, so it may be useful to package that together with them, or you want to look at their experience and the clients they've used. If you're using an individual contract writer, you want to get references, and you want to have a very specific contract in place for that lists the number of reviews the IB will go through. Sometimes, like I said, you usually need 3 reviews, so I would probably put that in a contract with the medical writer you would use. And that you need to establish who's doing QC as well. I think that's an important thing to have in a contract as well. Again, it may be useful to package in the IB with a CRO that's conducting your, helping you conduct your clinical trials as well. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Why don't we work on the workshop part? So there are sheets of paper at your tables. So so I'm going to ask you to work together at each table. Looks like people are pretty evenly distributed, so I think this will work out okay. I also have handouts that I see you have at each table, so I provided handouts to help prepare a brief introduction on the mechanism of action of the drug. The drug in this case is called Sylvant. Thank you. So Sylvant is a monoclonal antibody for an orphan drug indication, actually called Castleman's disease. And it's a cancer-like condition. It's not quite a cancer, but it's a severe, life-threatening condition. It tends to be more prevalent in Asia. So actually, over 40% of our patients in clinical trials were Asian subjects. We had sites in Taiwan and Hong Kong and China, and also around the world, US and elsewhere. So this drug is a monoclonal antibody, as I said, single agent for this very rare disease. It's an anti-IL-6 compound. So I'd like you to use these materials I gave you, basically the prescribing information, and anything else in the other materials I provided. The one handout I gave that's labeled toxicology probably wouldn't be useful for the mechanism of action part of the drug. I'd also like you to work on an overview of the physical chemical characteristics of the drug. Again, thinking of these first two sections as being in the very high-level summary of the IB. So the high-level summary is more of an executive summary. So for the physical chemical characteristics, you only want a few sentences, maybe 3 sentences are fine for that. The introduction on the mechanism of action would be maybe one brief paragraph, maybe around 4 sentences or so, 4 or 5. And then the non-clinical findings are very important for an initial IB. So I'd like you to list out any non-clinical findings of the drug. You can bullet those or write a brief, small paragraph or 2 about that. The non-clinical findings you'll probably find in the prescribing information, as well as that the document labeled toxicology is actually from the European Public Assessment Report on the drug. That the EMA website, the CHMP website actually provides these EPARs, public assessment reports on drugs, that provide a nice overview of how the EU approved the drug. What data did they base the approval of the drug on? And they provide a nice summary of that on the European website. So I took that from that website. And all that information comes from the regulatory submissions that we did for the marketing application of the drug. So it represented the final kind of non-clinical toxicology information on the drug that we would have summarized that we did summarize in the IB. So again, just to summarize the workshop activity, write a mechanism of action on the drug, a brief paragraph, write a few sentences on the physical and chemical characteristics of the drug, and then list out or maybe write a brief paragraph on the non-clinical findings of the drug. And keep in mind that you're writing for an investigator, a busy physician who's seeing patients, maybe conducting 5 clinical trials. He or she doesn't have a lot of time to sift through tons of data. So keep it at a higher level, but make sure you want to cover all the important topics, though. So it's one of the big challenges in medical writing is learning the skills on how to summarize information and actually making things very succinct and palatable to a diverse audience. which may also include regulators who may not have the scientific background on that particular, area. So it's one of the challenges in medical writing is to make things in a good, succinct, concise, but accurate summary on the drug. So anyway, why don't you spend about 10 minutes doing this exercise, if you if you can. You can pick one of these topics, again, and just do one of them. You could sort of maybe just highlight sections you would use instead of maybe actually writing, whatever you feel comfortable doing in 10 minutes. How? Okay. So why don't we have a brief discussion on different sections you've written or highlighted in your source documents. We have a little less than 10 minutes left in the session, so does any team want to present on what they wrote for the mechanism of action section of the drug?
So it's actually just very brief, about 2-3 sentences. Sylvant is an anti-IL-6 chimeric monoclonal antibody that binds to human IL-6. We just copied the sentence, actually, from one of the documents. And overproduction of IL-6 is considered a key mechanism of multicentric Castleman's disease. And Sylvant can block IL-6 binding to membrane-bound and soluble form of IL-6 receptor, thus is expected to cure MCD disease. That's it. Actually, just 3 sentences.
Okay. All right. That's very good. I just one comment that the first couple sentences were excellent. For the initial IB, we might go into a little bit more detail on the like it's an IgG monoclonal antibody and so forth. We might provide a little bit more about the actual molecule, and the labeling gets even more higher level sometimes about mechanism of action because it's intended for patients as well as physicians. Then the last part about curing MCD, I don't think you want to go into that sort of level of detail about efficacy in an initial IB. So you may just want to state that it's anticipated to have benefits in MCD because of the high titers of IL-6 seen in MCD patients, but you don't want to use like the word cure or anything like that in an IB. Hopefully, it will cure MCD. It's actually incredibly effective, to be honest. But but I still wouldn't use the word cure. All right, but thank you very much. That was very good, Shay. Does anyone want to share the CMC section they may have written, or any materials they've used to write? Okay.
Okay, our team present the CMC part. Sylvan is a human mouse chimeric monoclonal antibody that binds human interleukin-6 produced by CHO cells. And Sylvan is supplied as a sterile, white, preservative-free lyophilized powder in single-use vials, which contains 100 milligram or 400 milligram cetuximab.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Did this other team want to share something too, or just for a comparison?
Following the constitution of the sterile water, the resulting pH is about 5.2, and the resulting solution is 20 milligram per ml to that.
All right, Shay. Yeah, I think that's a good additional detail there to add into the CMC section. I thought yours was very good too. The first part of it, I don't think you need to repeat that it's a chimeric anti-IL-6 antibody, because you would have stated that in the introduction of the summary initially. But I thought all the rest of it was great there. So thank you very much. Good job, everyone. Thank you. And last but not least, does anyone want to go over what they've listed as the non-clinical toxicology-related findings for Sylvant based on the materials that have been provided? Any team want to go for that?
The acute toxicity was not submitted. Repeated dose toxicity was done in mice with repeated dose is conducted in mice, and the dose is 9.2 to 46 milligram per kilogram, and the duration is 3 months to 6 months, and no finding. And they also done a repeated dose in monkey for 3 months and no finding. And there are no carcinogenesis study submitted, no genotoxic study submitted. And in fertility study, the dose was up to 100 milligram per kilogram per week. The duration is 7 weeks, and no effect was observed. And the reproductive organ toxicity, the dose is the NOAEL dose is 46 milligram per kilogram, and duration is 7 weeks. No effects was found in monkey. And that's all.
Okay, Shay. Does anyone else want to share any non-clinical tox findings? Or I think that pretty much summarizes it. The drug was considered very safe in non-clinical studies, so we did quite a number of clinical studies, and that also supported that initial finding that so in humans it was it's been pretty, has a good safety profile, as we say. We don't say it's safe, but has a good safety or adequate safety profile for performing clinical studies and also for administering to patients. But because it was found safe in animals and monkeys, it doesn't necessarily mean it was safe. It's a monoclonal antibody against human IL-6, so the non-clinical studies, may not have been as relevant, but we did do them, and with the best models we had at the time, but fortunately the clinical studies also panned out that the drug was very safe, or had a good safety profile. So So thanks again for your work in this workshop, and I hope you learned something about IBs and maybe got a little enthusiasm about IBs through this workshop. And does anyone else have any questions about IBs or medical writing in general? Okay, well, I won't delay you from getting home any further in rush hour here, but thanks again. It was really a pleasure speaking with you today, and thank you for hosting me in Taiwan.
谢谢，谢谢那个再一次谢谢 Ken Cochran，Mr. Ken Cochran。我想说，在我们结束之前，我想there's one thing I want to mention，就是。Any drug in a regulatory document, before we got approval, got approved by regulatory agency, we won't have brand name. Sylvant is a brand name. So there's one fundamental concept we need to have is we may have generic name or we may have a drug number. As in a company in a very early stage as an initial IB. And when you write the name of the molecule, actually you will use the compound number or the generic name if you have one. Just want to make sure you remember that. You always use the generic name until we got approval. But in most regulatory documents, I think, will we use that?
Yeah, we usually avoid brand names in regulatory documents. One reason is, at least in the past, there used to be various brand names for the same drug in different regions. Companies, fortunately, are tending to develop one brand name, hopefully one or two, maybe. But still, you want to avoid the promotional emphasis in regulatory documents, so we tend to avoid using the brand name. Sometimes with an IB, I'll just put it on the title page, and then we don't use it at all within the document. Sometimes you do want to list, if it's multiple brand names, then you can list like 5 different brand names, but just on the title page. And once you list the generic name, then you can use that generic name throughout the document. Just a little style point there. So.
And I think also there's emphasize is generic name is not a brand name. And so it's not a brand name, you don't capitalize it. So the first letter you won't cap, and that's in the beginning of the sentence or in the beginning of sentence. You will keep it as lowercase when you do in English writing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a good style point. So if you use the brand name, but you also have to use the generic name beside it in parentheses in lowercase. And then usually once you state it once, you can just use the generic name from then on in the document. It's a little bit more, it becomes, then the text actually becomes reusable. You can use the text in different documents with that same generic name without worrying about brand names in different regions. So.
Once again, thank you, Kent.
Thank you.
所以现在谢谢大家，今天大家的参与，然后还有发言，大家的踊跃参加，然后还有那个提出很好的问题。